Explain like I'm five. Why does seafood go bad so much faster than other meat? Because the bacteria in them evolved to be tolerant of the cold temperatures of being submerged in ocean water. The bacteria in cows, chickens, or pigs, who all hang out in warm, sunny fields, get slowed down to a crawl in your fridge. The bacteria in fish and shrimp are perfectly comfortable at those temperatures. Which is exactly why we, unfortunately, boil many sea creatures alive. It's as much a freshness thing as it is a safety thing. Some of them literally start going bad the second they die. Fixed. There are two primary contributing factors to this. 1. Land animals have more sugar content in their muscles. This is converted into lactic acid upon death, making it harder for bacteria to make it their home. When fish die, they end up with a more neutral pH, creating a more hospitable environment. 2. Fish have different kinds of fats and oils, among other things, that are more prone to spoilage. This gives older fish its trademark rancid odor, which can often be removed with a rinse of cool running water, as the spoiled oils are often on the surface. When 1 happens, the fish can make you sick. When 2 happens, it will taste more fishy and be unappealing, but probably won't give you any illnesses. Seafood has more unsaturated fat than land animals. Unsaturated fat remains liquid at lower temperatures than saturated fat. Coconut oil, ghee, and cocoa butter become hard and stiff in a cool room. And if you're a fish living in cold water, you don't want your fat to become stiff, as it won't be able to move throughout your body or let things pass through it. All cell membranes have fat as a part of them. Unsaturated fat is also more prone to oxidation because it's a less stable structure than saturated fat. It's missing 1 or more double bonds in the fatty acid chain, and oxygen will bond to where that double bond is missing. Oxygen is a corrosive factor, causing things to break down. This is really interesting. I had no idea that seafood goes bad faster because of the bacteria and fats. I always thought it was just because it's from the ocean. So the bacteria in fish and shrimp are comfortable at cold temperatures, unlike the bacteria in cows and chickens. And fish have more unsaturated fat, which remains liquid at lower temperatures and is more prone to spoilage. Plus, the different kind of fats and oils in fish can give older fish a rancid odor. It's so fascinating to learn about the science behind why seafood goes bad faster. So why does it matter if the fats in fish become stiff? And does the type of seafood impact how quickly it spoils? I'm curious to know more. Let me know in the comments down below, and let's move right into our next Reddit post. Explain like I'm 5. If a human being was born in the wild and left alone, when this person grows to be able to think, would they think using a language of their own, or would they just develop an understanding of the world around? They would develop some understanding of the world around them, but no, they would not develop language on their own. We've already experimented with this before. Kept newborns in isolation, even when other humans did interact. They had strict orders to not speak to them. The children grew up without language, being completely mute even by ages 3 to 6. The experiments were quickly discontinued when it became clear that we were severely disabling orphans for the sake of discovering the origin of language, which turns out to be more of a communal trait rather than an individual one. I was a student teacher in a class of 8 and 9-year-olds, and there was a girl in there who turned up to school at age 5 without any language. Her parents had raised her in a corner of the commercial kitchen where they worked. She had picked up no language at all. All she could do was grunt. 3 to 4 years of schooling, and she had the language of a 5-year-old. Talking to a child in those early years is so vital to their language development. There have been many cases of this happening with varying results. Sometimes they integrate back into society and learn to speak, and sometimes not. The age limit seems to be around 3. Presumably, children abandoned before then are unable to survive, even if taken in by an animal. So someone who grew up alone, with no contact with another human or society in general, would most likely think in pure images, with a little sound. Said person would have no need to develop some kind of language, as they have no one to communicate ideas to other than themselves. Plenty of people have no internal monologue, even with language. If you have seen any newborn, you'll instantly know that any person being born in the wild and left alone right away would not survive. So they would need someone to nurture them to at least over a year old. Let's say after being abandoned, luckily, a monkey or some animal found the baby and decided to raise him. The baby will grow up with the herd, learn their behavior and ways of communication of that animal. They will understand the world a bit above that of wild animals, but not as sophisticated as a regular human that lives in human society. This is a really interesting and thought-provoking topic. It's kind of sad to think about the orphaned children who were left without language and the effects it had on their development. It's crazy to think that talking to a child in those early years is so vital to their language development. And the idea of someone growing up alone in the wild and developing their own understanding of the world is both fascinating and kind of sad. But imagine someone growing up completely alone, without any contact with society. They might not develop a language at all since they have no one to communicate with. They'd probably just think in pure images and maybe a little sound. It's wild to think about how much we rely on language for communication and understanding. I'm really curious about whether or not any of the children raised in isolation were able to eventually learn a language and integrate back into society. Do you know if there are any cases where this has happened? And do you think it's even possible for someone to develop language on their own without any exposure to it? Let me know in the comments down below, and let's move right into our next Reddit post. Explain like I'm 5. What exactly is turbulence, and is it at all an indication of danger during a flight? The biggest concern we have as airline pilots is how stupid we will look if we encounter turbulence immediately after turning the seatbelt sign off. That's about as far as our concerns about turbulence go. I will remember this random comment every time I fly. Thank you, kind stranger. Turbulence used to make me nervous, but not after today. It's like hitting waves with a boat. Air is a fluid and behaves just like water, except it's mostly invisible. Short answer: an aircraft experiences turbulence as it moves through air that is changing direction and velocity, similar to a boat hitting waves. It is rarely dangerous. Longer answer: there are different types and severity of turbulence. The light turbulence you often encounter is just slight variations in the air as you fly through it. Moderate turbulence, while not dangerous to the aircraft, is noticeable, and you would have a hard time walking, or your drink might spill. One might encounter this while entering the jet stream, flying around thunderstorms, flying through thermals on a hot summer day, or flying over mountain ranges. Severe turbulence is extremely rare and causes a momentary loss of control for the aircraft. It is more likely to be found if a plane accidentally penetrates a thunderstorm or other severe weather. In over a decade of flying, I've never experienced severe turbulence. We are actually prohibited from flying through it if we know it exists. Extreme turbulence is the highest severity and can cause structural damage to the aircraft. It is incredibly rare and would most likely be associated with severe thunderstorms, which we avoid. There is also wake turbulence, which is turbulence generated by all aircraft as they fly through the air. A smaller aircraft flying through a larger aircraft's wake turbulence can be highly dangerous, but there are techniques we use to avoid it. Some of the most dangerous aviation-related weather phenomena are microbursts, a form of wind shear produced by thunderstorms. Basically, a sudden, massive downdraft that drops from the sky. While flying into a microburst might not actually be that turbulent, the downdrafts can overpower a jet aircraft and cause them to crash low to the ground. Modern airlines have onboard systems to detect wind shear, so we can firewall the thrust and get away from the ground. Very simply, it's a strong gust of wind that affects the normal motion of the plane. It is, however, very rarely dangerous, as planes have been built and pilots have been trained with this in mind. Most injuries occur from passengers not taking the recommended precautions of staying in their seats and having all overhead lockers closed. You in turbulence. Are we going to die? Pilots in turbulence Darn it, I spilled my juice. Airframes are incredibly strong, and it would take some remarkable turbulence, think severe thunderstorm, to cause damage. The discussion about turbulence is interesting and informative. Oh man, let me tell you all about turbulence. So, you know how when you're in the car and it hits a bump in the road, you feel a little jolt? Well, when a plane is flying through the air, it can hit bumps too, but they're caused by changes in the wind. This can make the plane shake and bounce around, which some people find scary. But here's the thing. Planes are built to handle turbulence, just like how cars are built to handle bumpy roads. So even though it might feel bumpy, it's actually very rare for turbulence to be dangerous. Pilots are trained to deal with it, and the plane's design can withstand pretty strong turbulence. So next time you're on a plane and it gets a little shaky, just remember that it's totally normal and nothing to worry about. Have you ever been on a plane during turbulence? What was your experience like? Let me know in the comments down below, and let's move right into our next Reddit post. Explain like I'm 5. Why do companies typically choose to implement layoffs affecting numerous employees rather than considering salary reductions for top executives like the CEO? Say you have 10,000 employees and they earn $50,000 a year, and say you cut 10% of them. That's 1,000 by 50,000, so $50 million in savings. That is way more than you could get by trimming salaries of executives. Not saying it's right, especially if they take no hit at all. The best examples of leadership usually have a CEO say they'll reduce their pay by X% when they reduce salaries or work time or whatever it is for however long. But in terms of what shifts the bottom line the fastest, it's an order of magnitude greater the largest the company is to cut labor. If you think of why the company lost revenue and needs to cut costs, maybe they lost a contract, so they don't need to produce as much. Maybe demand is down, so they don't need to produce as much. Maybe there's a better tech allowing an individual worker to be much more productive, so they don't need as many workers. Most reasons center around they don't need as many workers as before. They still need the executives and sales agents and so on. It's the people producing the product who are most at risk, because that's usually the main issue. They just don't need to produce as much, or they don't need as many people to maintain productive levels. A good sales agent can almost always sell more. One good example I remember, I think from James Collins' Good to Great, was that a large company lost a big contract worth around 20% of their revenue. They said they needed to cut costs by around 20% to survive the year. So the executives took a 20% cut first. This doesn't move the needle, but they start there to show the workforce and lead by example kind of thing. And they reduced everyone's hours by 20%. Rather than fire everyone, they figured better everyone suffer a little than 1/5 suffer a lot. Then the workers swapped shifts. So those who really needed the income would take extra shifts, and those who could afford an extra day off would swap with them. This was a more empathetic and transparent way, and this company survived and came back stronger. Production increased in profitability by more than they lost over time because of that team aspect now. To add to that, your cost savings only mention salary, so it's even greater when factoring in the various employee benefits, retirement match, sick, vacation days, healthcare. It's all expenditure that the employee doesn't see as a number, but still costs the company. There's a good scene in The Office, US version, where Michael Scott is negotiating the buyout for his new company, and the CFO says that giving the 3 staff members their jobs, with dental and healthcare and so on, is a multi-million-dollar buyout. Take the figures with a grain of salt, but it's a solid point. So $1,000 by $50,000 equals $50 million, plus the other expenses associated for each employee. C-suite pay cuts wouldn't come close to comparing. The simple answer is because the executives are the ones doing the layoffs and are unlikely to give themselves a pay cut in the process. There are situations where CEOs will accept effectively zero pay for their work, but this is mostly a publicity stunt. Steve Jobs took a salary of $1 every year from 1997 to 2011. However, during this time his stocks increased from $7.5 million to $2.2 billion, showing that his executive salary was a joke by comparison. Executive salaries and total compensation are usually attached to the stock price. By laying people off, the stock price will likely rise, giving the executives effectively a bonus. This can seem cruel, and it is to the employees, but it's considered the right thing to do for the shareholders and shows off one of the major flaws in the corporate system. It's also important to note that while laying off workers usually increases the stock price, firing a CEO or top-level executive lowers the stock price. Asking executives to take a pay cut will often cause them to leave or be forced to be paid out golden parachutes. Since executive salaries are high across the industry, you will also struggle to hire quality replacements at a lower salary. The executive salaries are also not that significant in the grand scheme of things. HP, for example, laid off upwards of 6,000 workers recently. If we assume the average salary was $50,000 on the low end, that's $300,000 in salary alone, let alone associated benefits, training, etc. Whereas the CEO of HP has a listed salary of $20 million, which while still the equivalent pay to 400 low-level employees, it's still a drop in the bucket compared to the layoffs. This sums up a lot, but I'd like to add that low-level employees are usually the easiest to absorb and the easiest to replace, rehire when the time is right. Because more often than not, a pay reduction for the C-suite wouldn't realistically be enough to cover the money saved by the layoffs anyway. This obviously depends drastically on what industry the company in question is involved in, but no matter what, it's important to point out that someone's pay is not the same as the cost associated with keeping them employed. When you consider things like administrative overhead, benefits, workplace safety stuff, even relatively cheap labor can get expensive fast. $1 million sounds like a lot, and to an individual it is. But if a $50K USD employee costs an additional $50K to keep employed, not to mention any admin staff, then a $1 million pay cut for the CEO could let 10 people keep their jobs, but even. For how long? And will those 10 retained employees be worth it relative to the increased value they generate/revenue they bring in? Because deciding to lay people off starts with the CEO and board of directors, they are not going to fire themselves. This is a very interesting and frustrating topic. It's sad to see how workers are often the ones who bear the brunt of cost-cutting measures, while top executives remain largely unaffected. The fact that by simply laying off employees, companies are able to save significantly more money than by reducing executive salaries is disheartening. It's also eye-opening to see the various reasons behind layoffs, such as lost contracts or decreased demand, which necessitate cutting costs. The example of a company that involved its entire workforce in addressing cost reductions and survived is quite inspiring. It shows that there are alternative, more empathetic ways for companies to navigate difficult financial situations. It's also alarming to learn about the significant costs associated with keeping employees employed, far beyond just their salary. It's clear that the decision-making around layoffs and executive compensation is complex and often comes down to prioritizing shareholder interests over the well-being of employees. Why do you think it's so difficult for companies to prioritize both their financial health and the livelihoods of their employees? Can companies truly strike a balance between the two? Well, that's another episode of Explain Like I'm Five in the books. I really appreciate all of you who made it this far into the video. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, it would really help the channel out a lot if you gave the video a thumbs up, subscribe, or leave a comment down below. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.